This is part of our ongoing Intro to Networking series, so if you got an interview or something coming up, be sure to check out the playlist. But today, we're here to answer the question, what is a running configuration and what is a startup configuration? You want to know? Stick around. Let's get into it. So, most switches and routers follow what I think of as the Cisco style of configuration. And that is to say that anytime you type some command in, you're modifying something called the running configuration. The running configuration you can think of essentially as a text file that just literally has a list of commands that someone's typed in, or maybe some defaults in there as well. And that defines the way that switch or router is going to operate. By the way, we don't always call that by its whole name, right? So running configuration, you might say much more likely running config, or maybe even just run. Now, the trickiest thing about the running configuration is that it lives in RAM. And what happens to everything in RAM when you reboot? Yeah, it's gone. Okay, and so if the running configuration is all the commands you've typed in and defines the way the switch runs, and it lives in RAM and you reboot and it's gone, huh? Oh, it's okay. They thought about it. And basically what it comes down to is there is another file as well called the startup configuration. The startup configuration is a copy of the running configuration, but saved onto the little drive inside that switch or router. That startup configuration is often called startup config, startup, or even just start. And every time that switch or router reboots, it checks to see if there's a startup config file. If so, it's going to copy that line by line into the running configuration. If there's not a startup configuration on there because you just haven't saved one, or maybe you deleted the one that was on there to wipe it out, well, it's just going to boot up basically in factory default settings. On routers, that default often means no networks and every port is shut down, so watch out for that. So how do you save? Well, pretty straightforward command, but let's just write it down so you don't have to just listen, I think, Tiny Brian? Tiny Brian, yes! Okay, so this isn't actually command line here, right? But if you were in your switch, the prompt would be very much something like Cisco or whatever, and then a pound symbol for that executive privilege prompt. And from there, you would type in the command. The whole thing would be copy running-configuration space startup-configuration. And what you're doing there is literally saying, hey, copy. And the first is the source, the second is the destination. So whatever is currently in the running configuration, you're going to take that and overwrite whatever is currently in the startup configuration. If there's not one there yet, because it's the first time you're setting up the switch, cool, you just made one. Otherwise, it's just going to overwrite that going forward. Now, again, we don't always say running-configuration, startup-configuration when we're talking about it amongst each other, and we also don't necessarily type it. So we might also much more likely type copy, run, start. Because in switches and routers, generally speaking from the command line, you don't have to type the whole thing, as long as it's enough that it couldn't be anything else. For most switch and router vendor operating systems, it'll just autocomplete for you. So copy, run, start, or maybe even COP space R space S would get you there, which kind of depends. But this isn't the only way. Depending on the operating system, maybe you might have write memory, which is actually an older Cisco command that doesn't always work anymore on Cisco's, but other vendors have adopted that as well. As I say, this is an older one, but this write memory is the exact same thing as copy, run, start. Now, just as an aside, there are other ways of handling things without running configs and startup configs. I'm not going to get into that so much in this one, but for those of you over on a Juniper, you're probably looking for something like commit. Okay, story time. And I think, for a rare occasion, Giant Brian? Giant Brian! Okay, so once upon a time, fairly often, I get folks coming to me for help thinking that their switch had died. They say, hey, the power went out and, they must have fried the switch. And the reason they're thinking was going that way was basically because the power went out, and when it came back on again, well, that chunk of the network wasn't working. Guess it got fried. Well, that's when you get into something like, oh, gee, maybe you need to talk to your insurance company about that. Or maybe we could take a look at it. And I think probably you already guessed it. Yeah, almost certainly they had been running potentially for years with a fully configured switch working great that they'd never saved the config on. And here it was months or years later, and, unplanned power off of the unit comes back up. There's no startup config defaults. And maybe that's something like single untagged VLAN 1, all the ports are up. Maybe that's all the ports are shut down, but either way, it's not what they were expecting, and that's why they were asking for help. So, moral of the story? Save your configuration, right? You are not done configuring until you save, right? Copy, run, start, write memory, maybe commit, depending on what you're doing. And also, really, really good idea, go ahead and save that running config off to some file server or something, someplace where everybody on the team can find it. All right, everybody. So, big picture again, running configuration is for any Cisco-style switch or router. That is basically a document that defines here's the commands controlling the way that switch or router is running right now. Startup config is a second file that's on the internal drive because the running config is just in RAM. And so when you reboot, running config is lost. When you come back online, startup config gets copied into the running config, and now you got a new one. And if you didn't save, well, your running config is default probably. Okay, everybody, this continues to be a blast. Thanks for coming out. I hope you're having a good time too. Do me a favor, hit that subscribe button, like it if you like it, and let me know down in the I almost said in the chat. Let me know down in the comments if you've ever run into some problem like this. Oh my goodness. All right, we'll see you next time.